This podcast is presented by the Prince George's County Memorial Library System.
The conversation with our second community expert was so good, we decided to release it as its own bonus episode. Join me, Ella of Ella's Ephemeras, as I chat with St. Mark's Church Historian Sandra Johnson. How long have you been a historian there?
Maybe about 20 years or more.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And I've worked on several projects with the Laurel Historical Society and the Laurel Museum, and helping them with exhibits that have to do with African American citizens in Laurel and African American life in Laurel.
Oh, that's awesome. We've only recently, I think, started working with the Laurel Historical Society, but they included us in their exhibit a few years ago, and we were taken back by how much information we didn't know about our own library system. So they just do exceptional work. I could never be a historian.
They're a wealth of knowledge. I've learned several things from them as well. So, things about the Rosenwald schools, and just things, just little tidbits of African American history that are not really written down, that I've learned through their very intense research that they've been doing over the years. And it's really been nice because to be included, because for a long time African American history for Laurel residents wasn't that just wasn't that prevalent. People just didn't know that much about it. So now with the Laurel Historical Society and the people that they have there, they've been very interested in including us and just becoming knowledgeable about African American life in Laurel.
Oh, that's great. We have at the Prince George County Memorial Library System, our Oxon Hill branch has an ongoing oral history, specifically for historically African American towns in Prince George County. And even with that, that was so recently started, whereas obviously we have residents who have been here for generations.
Right. Yes. So, it's really nice that they have really been interested in African American life in Laurel and Prince George's County. And I've learned so much about, the struggles, the way people lived, how segregated Prince George's County was, how segregated Laurel was. But when you're a small child, you take a lot of things for granted. You know that you're aware of it because you know that there's certain places you can go, certain places you can't go, places you felt comfortable being in those settings, other places. But it was just to the point where there were just places where you just couldn't go. Which was, the young people now in Laurel just take those things for granted. It was nothing for them to just say, oh, I feel like going to the Laurel pool today. It's hot outside. I'd like to go to the Laurel pool, and just go. Whereas we knew we just couldn't go. And it seems strange now in 2021, but when I grew up in Laurel, that you just didn't go. You just weren't allowed to go there.
So I'm not from Maryland, but I definitely, in talking to people that are from Laurel, there is this kind of like, oh, Laurel's so progressive. Laurel's always been so progressive, but that's just not true at a certain point. Laurel wasn't, as far as I understand, didn't seem to be this magical place that was separate from the rest of Maryland.
Well, it depends on your age. Now, if you are, let's say, 30 years old, you may think that it's this very progressive city because Laurel is just so different now than the way that I grew up. And it was different for me than it was, let's say, for my parents. Because, that's why reading the book was just so interesting because I could really see why This book was required reading for junior high, middle school, and high school students because I was talking to my oldest daughter, and she was telling me that she read it. Of course, I think the book was written in the 70s.
I believe mid 80s was the first.
Okay. Okay. Well, then I was way past college, high school and college. I never read it. I'd heard of it, but I had never read it. And when when it was suggested, I said the title of the book piqued my interest because I do remember my daughter, I did remember hearing about the book, but not reading it. And because I'm a retired teacher, so instead of reading that, I was grading papers for the students. But when I read the book, it was a page turn. I just couldn't put it down because it reminded me so much of things that not necessarily that I experienced, because the setting of the book was about 1933, something like that, and the deep South, and but things just came back to my attention as to some of the things that maybe my parents experienced living in Prince George's County, or things that older people, because I do live in Baltimore, and things that older people in Baltimore, in the Baltimore school system, they told me about, and how, you had two separate school systems. I mean, under one umbrella, but they were both completely different. The way they were funded, the way, so, it brought back a lot of memories to me of things that I had been told. So I really enjoyed reading the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good.
So I can see why it's required reading, because some people don't experience it, but they know that things like this did happen, and how the strength of the young people in the book, the strength of their family and their family structure, their work ethic, their values, their morals, all of that just came into play into, reading the book. So I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good. I'm so glad. I, like you, I didn't read the book as a child for required reading, but I did read it as an adult before, and I recently reread it for this podcast. But I definitely do think knowing myself as I was as a student, I'm kind of glad I read it as I was older, because I feel like I wouldn't have absorbed it as much when I was a child and kind of forced by my teacher to read it.
I can understand that, because I probably would have done the same thing, because sometimes when you're forced to read things, sometimes you don't get the understanding, or you're reading it so that you can maybe pass a test, or answer review questions or something, like, not for the true meaning of the novel. And that's a very good point as to reading it when it's required, as to just reading it just for, just knowledge for yourself, and just broadening your horizons or broadening your experiences. Is completely different.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely. It absolutely was a page turner. When I read it the first time, read it all in one day. I just read through it very quickly. It's an exceptionally good book now that I was reading it more, because I chose to, not because I was asked to in school.
Right.
So based on, you had mentioned stories that you've heard from people that grew up in the local area, specifically around Baltimore County. Based on your historical knowledge, it sounds like you feel like the book is an accurate portrayal of the 1930s?
Oh, certainly, because as I said, I did a presentation for the Laurel Historical Society on African American life in the Grove, because the African American section of Laurel was called the Grove, and it was, I don't know if you'd ever heard that term, but it was called the Grove because there was a large oak grove that really surrounded the community. It's not there now because 198 sort of, when progression came and things like that. But it was known as the Grove. And as I said, I did a presentation. I did several. I did one about African American life, and I also did one about the segregation of schools in Laurel as well. But anyway, with the combination of both, I interviewed a lot of older people who have really passed on right now, but they talked about not being able to attend Laurel High School. I don't know if you're familiar with the location, but Laurel High School is, steps away from the Black community in Laurel. So some people, could have just could have walked to that school in less than 5 minutes. So the fact that they couldn't attend the high school, and they had to go to, the all Black school in Lakeland, which is College Park. I thought about that when I read the book. I also thought about how in the book, the children wondered why, there was no bus service for them, no transportation service for them, where they had to walk miles to go to school, where the white children were bused.
Mm.
And it was the same thing for them. There was Prince George's County did not provide bus service for any Black students in the county.
Oh,
the people who were in Laurel, they had to either catch the train down to Lakeland, which is, off of Route 1 in College Park, or they had to get there the best way that they could, which really meant that, was a reason why a lot of people didn't complete high school, because it was just too difficult to get there, or your parents couldn't afford to send you on the train every day. So with that came to mind with me, that was an actual thing that happened, where Prince George's County did not provide bus service for Black students at that time. And we're talking about the same time, maybe in the 30s, the 1930s. And as I said, they couldn't walk to Laurel High School because that was for white children only. When they talked about getting used books, some friends here in Baltimore would tell me that they remember getting textbooks that had other people's names written in them. They were soiled. You could tell that they were very used, and but they had been books that no longer were used for white students, and now they were given to the Black students to use. And so, there was quite a few things that happened in the book that really made me, reflect back on to what the older people in Laurel had told me about the educational system there, or my friends in Baltimore who basically told me the same thing. So I could relate to that. Not myself, because when I started school, integration had really started. We didn't have that problem of transportation not being available to us or anything like that. But luckily, as I said, being the church historian, I was able to speak with the older members of St. Mark's, and they were a wealth of knowledge, and they could, tell me about their personal experiences.
that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt it, but because this is a historical fiction, and fiction does allow more freedom than just a straight nonfiction, was there anything in the book that you feel like could have or should have been told differently, might have been changed, anything that could have been added, removed?
It was kind of hard for me because number one, I didn't really grow up in the Deep South, nor did I have relatives in the Deep South. I do remember things about my parents used to get things like Jet Magazine, and which was a weekly publication. It's no longer in existence. I don't know if it's online or whatever, but anyway, it used to be mailed to the home every week, or you'd go and you'd buy one. And I do remember looking in that magazine sometimes and seeing things like lynchings and things that were going on in the South, and to the point where I was telling my husband, and I was just the other day, I said, I grew up with a fear of the South. I had a fear of going past Washington D.C., going into. I really had a fear, and that was basically because I didn't have relatives living in the South. And my husband was telling me, well, maybe if you have visited, because his mother was from Savannah, Georgia. He didn't go all the time, but they did frequent the South. And his mother, sometimes when, before she passed, she would talk to me about things. And she said everything, it was very segregated in Georgia, in Savannah, of course. But they just seemed to, were able to enjoy life in certain types of ways. Because a lot of things that they had their own, like they had their own movie theaters, which I didn't experience in Laurel. Because when we were able to go to the movie theater, I think Black people were sitting in the balcony and white people were sitting then, on the main level. But she said that they had their own movie theaters, their own sources of entertainment and things like that. And so she said that, it was very segregated, but, they just seemed to manage, but certain things didn't go on, lynchings, it wasn't, I don't remember her saying it was so prevalent in the city, but in the rural parts of the South, as the book was, that you could, always hear about a lot of lynchings going on and people struggling to keep their properties, being sharecroppers, not really owning their own land, working for other people, and never really being in a position to own their own property. It was as if the more they worked the land, they still couldn't get ahead. They still couldn't become property owners and things like that. But I'm trying to think if I thought something could have been written better or differently.
And no is a great answer too.
Right. And I just couldn't, I just didn't read the nook and said, well, why did they do this? Why did they do that? I just didn't read it that way.
And that's great. And that's definitely, and I'm sure you're familiar with, sometimes you read a book, even a nonfiction book, and, completely, factual, and you read it and you're like, why did they present it like that?
Right. Well, I have read books like that, where I said, well, this is someone insulting my intelligence.
Yeah.
Or something like that, or saying that really that's not logical or doesn't make sense. But I didn't get that sense when I was reading, because certain parts of it were just so intense. You said, oh my goodness, what's going to happen, because, we hear about things like, well, the KKK just riding up in the middle of the night and dragging people from their homes and burning their properties and killing people or really assaulting people. So, you knew those type of things happen. So, because I was reading over your question, before our session today, and I read the question about what would you have liked to have seen different. I said I couldn't think of a thing, really. I just thought it was well written. Maybe someone else who really lived in the South or had really close relatives, maybe they could have a different opinion about the way certain things were written or the way certain things were expressed. But for me, no.
And I do think it was obviously a very heavy book emotionally, but I never felt at any time that it was overwhelmingly so. I think it was an exceptionally well written, the tone of it, the pace of it. I personally wouldn't change a single thing about it.
Oh, good, because I wouldn't even, and I thought of, because it was such a good reading for young people, and I think that if it had been too gory and too intense, it would have been too graphic. I don't think it could have held their interest, or if it did, it would have just, the message would have been lost.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole underlying thing of their family structure, of their love for the land that they owned and the pride that they took in being property owners, not just sharecroppers. Even being able to survive with their father being gone so much of the time, because he was working in the north and he was really being away from home just so that they could continue to be property owners, to afford to pay the taxes, and just because they weren't people who really lived above their means, but they just appreciated everything that they had. They loved their family. They really valued the relationships within the family structure. So, and I think that if it had been too graphic, I think all of that really would have been lost.
Absolutely. And I definitely agree with the emphasis that was on not only the family as individuals, but also as the structure and how they related to each other, that you didn't just see one or two family members interacting, but you saw them in small groups, one-on-one, as a whole.
Right. And how they helped each other to deal with everything that was going on. How I'm sure that they were envied by a lot of other people, envied by some, hated by others. Others were jealous of them because they just were such a dynamic family. As I said, the fact that some family members were working and just to help to pay the taxes and to keep the property going, and a lot of, you can see that they were a rarity where they lived. It wasn't the normal, because most of the people who lived in their surrounding county and area, they were sharecroppers, and they just did just enough just to get by, and never becoming property, and owning property really meant a lot, as it did. I remember growing up with my grandfather and my grandmother. They always talked about the importance of owning property, and came from years and years of not having it, not doing that, because they took a lot of pride in owning property and not renting, and I'm sure that's where that type of value system came from the South, from here, where people everybody, they didn't own their own homes. They were renting, and but when you owned something, that meant a lot. It meant a lot, because there wasn't a lot of things that set you apart in the Black community. Because as in this novel, there weren't a lot of professional people. There weren't a lot of doctors, lawyers. So, but if you owned your own property, that's sort of like, set you apart from everybody else. So part of the Black experience. So, as I said, I could just talk about this book, because I tell you, I just found myself just.
And I'm surprised you'd never read it. Like I said, I read it as an adult, so I'm not terribly surprised, but I'm so glad that you had the opportunity to read it, and I am honored that I'm here to talk to you about it. I don't want to take up too much of your time, because I did promise 20 to 30 minutes, but are there any questions that I didn't ask, or some part of the book that you really wanted to talk about? It's kind of open forum at this point.
Because I've been just talking.
Good.
I think I just basically hit on everything, because as I said, every time every so often, as I was reading the book, I was saying, I do remember something like that, someone telling me about something like this, or someone telling me that they experienced something like that, because thank God things are a lot different now. But just to know that these things were just so commonplace, where they talked about no matter what was done, you knew that the white residents would not be prosecuted, would not be jailed for. And I thought, when I thought back to the George Floyd trial where the white officer was convicted. And some people probably would say they probably never thought they'd see that in their lifetimes. And just to think something, but, it lets you know we aren't where we should be, but we're not where we used to be. And, those types of things that, used to occur on a daily basis. And it was just the way it was. You just said, well, and that their parents said that a few times, and their grandmother said that a few times. Well, that's just the way it is. That's just the way things are. We just have to live with it. We just have to learn how to survive with it. And that's just what they did. That's what they did. So, but as I said, I just thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't think I'd change anything. I will probably go back and reread that book within about a year or so, but I have a grandson, but he's too young to even think about it. But hopefully I'll be around to see him read the book and discuss it. But I'm going to tell everybody in my family, everyone I know, if you have not read this book, you've got to read the book. You've got to just to get that experience and just to, to reflect upon what life was like in rural Mississippi in 1933.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad we got to talk about it.
Thanks for joining us for this special bonus episode of These Books Made Me. We'll see you next episode.